Hey, you have Patrick Findoro here, co-founder at Visa Franchise Embedded Biz. Excited to have on Mitch Wexler, partner at Fragaman. We've been working with Mitch as well as his colleagues at Fragaman on cases across different visa categories, but a lot of clients specifically on the E-2 visa. For today's live stream, we'll be talking about franchise investments as a path to getting U.S. residency, and Mitch will walk through some of the different visa options that are eligible for doing an investment in a franchise. So, Mitch, thanks for joining today.
Yeah, I was looking forward to it. Happy to be here, Patrick. We go back a long way, so
Definitely.
nice to present with you again.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. So, I guess why there's a lot of different ways people can move to the US through investing, whether it's starting their own business, independent business, buying an existing business, buying an existing franchise, starting a franchise. What are some of the appeals of a franchise business as it fits into these different visa categories?
Well, I think the biggest appeal or the biggest pro, and there are pros and cons to every option, but the biggest pro
Exactly.
probably for a franchise is it's more turnkey. There's if you pick a good one, which your group will certainly assist with. It's a proven model. They have a profit history. They have operational history, so it's less risky. As I said, there's going to be risk in any kind of new venture,
Yeah.
especially in a new country. But the franchise model, it can be a tried and true vehicle for a multitude of types of visas. The E2, which we're going to talk about at some length, it could be an L1, which is for intra-company transferees. So if someone has a business in Johannesburg or Mumbai, a hotel there, doesn't have to be a hotel here. It could be a yoga shop franchise here. As long as the two entities are sufficiently legally linked, that could be a good vehicle for an L1 intercompany transferee. If they don't have a business to tie the U.S. enterprise to, then we're talking once again about E2s. There's no need for a connection with an E2.
And I'd love to dive a little more into the L1, but E2, kind of what do you want to see before you're comfortable setting
Mhm.
up the interview and putting the applicant in front of the consular officer?
Yeah. Um, well, there's a checklist, as you could imagine, but it always comes down to usually the amount of the investment. So what they call the substantiality requirement for E2. And it's the first question I always get asked, what's a
Oh, I
substantial
see.
investment? Yeah. And it's just not mentioned in the law. There's no magic dollar amount forever. But we like to see, just an answer to your question, we like to see 100K or so. We've gotten them approved for as low as 40, 50K, but the more the better. So 100K, I like to see six digits
Yeah, I
for,
mean,
for
I've heard these stories of people getting approved for a lot less, and we've had one like around 60K, but I'd
yeah,
rather deal with like 95% odds than like 60 or
yeah.
70% odds.
And that might require maybe buying two franchises, you know, and under one umbrella company, and that's the entity that will serve as the investment vehicle. So that's
For
common
sure.
also.
And we've seen some creative solutions too, like where it could be like a real estate brokerage or property management franchise, and maybe the initial investment's just like 50K, but
Right.
you're going to need a vehicle and you're going to be going around, a bunch of different properties in LA County or wherever you're opening up. So that
Hmm.
that would count as part of the investment, and we haven't had pushback so
Hmm.
far from the consulate officers on including some of these other expenses that are needed to run the business.
I think another practical consideration, if one is trying to get away with the lowest possible investment, and let's say we
Sure.
even get them the E2 visa for a 50K investment, a critical component of any E2 application package is the E2 business plan. So many of these entrepreneurs have a business plan already, but we always strongly recommend buying a separate E2 oriented business plan. So it checks off all the boxes. And one of those boxes is job creation. So eventually, we'd like to see, within several years, maybe five, a handful, half a dozen jobs. And for a franchise that you could buy for 50, $60,000, it's probably a one or two person operation. So it might not have the legs needed to achieve the ultimate objective. If that is to keep it for a while and convert it to a green card one way or another.
How do you see for setting up holding companies, because we've had clients do that where they set up an investment consulting company, and it's like the franchise is kind of the anchor, but then they expand
Mhm.
upon those activities.
Yeah, that's fine. And typically the franchise, the entity that drops down is 100% owned by the holding company, and then maybe they'll buy a motel, they'll buy a yogurt shop, and all that's fine, and you can aggregate all those jobs. So that's a pretty common solution.
I find the E-2 is like a pretty straightforward visa as long as you tick the box and present the case well. And having those key components, having a solid business plan. But on the L1, we've had probably, I don't know, 35, 40 clients do the L1 and then the EB-1C, and that's definitely a lot more complex. And we'll
Yeah.
take those clients on, but it's just there's a lot more moving parts. And I think it starts with, what's the business look like in their home company, in their home country. So if it's an entrepreneur in Johannesburg, South Africa, what type of business do you want to see that they should be eligible to go forward with the L1?
Mhm. Well, I first of all, I like E2s better than L1s. If the U.S. enterprise is what they consider a new office, which is one that's been viable trading for less than a year, which is not always, but often the case, the L1 duration initially is going to be for 1 year.
That's tough.
And there's an L1 business plan too, just like I mentioned the E2. So there's an L1 centric business plan. So if after that 1 year you're not hitting the numbers that your L1 business plan said you're going to hit in terms of revenue and employees, they're not going to extend it. So theoretically, it's extendable for a total of 7 years. So you get 1, 2, 2, 2. So 2 year increments, opportunity to apply for 3. So if a family comes over, they put their kids in school, and you're on the 11th or 12th month already, and the numbers aren't good, it's a disaster. As compared to an E2, so the visa stamp typically for most nationalities, you get a 5-year visa stamp. So when E2 enters the US, they get admitted for a 2-year period straight away, 2 years. Each time they re-enter the US, they get a new 2 years. So these are international business people, so they're traveling, so it just gets automatically extended. Even if an E2 person enters the US on the last day of the 5-year validity of their stamp, they get another 2 years.
So
So
it
you
could
can
be six
you can
six
milk it for
years,
seven
11
years.
months, and
Yeah,
29 days.
that's right. So and if you need it beyond that and you're going to travel, you have to get a new E2 visa stamp, another 5-year stamp. But usually by then, either they have a green card already, if that's the ultimate objective, or the business is good enough to sustain another 5-year E2 visa stamp.
And
So
I
I
think
like E2s better.
we've never had an L1 where they had a passport that was eligible for the
Yeah,
E2. It's always
yeah,
been from countries that there's no treaty with the US for the E2.
that's right. And with an L1 strategy, a lot of people assume that once you're in the US with an L1, you can go for what they call what I call the L1 style green card, which you refer to as EB-1C, which is the name of that particular code. But it's a hard bell to ring, the EB-1C. They really want to see a complex organizational structure, like several levels reporting up to the ultimate manager, who's the investor, who's the client. So they had to have been a manager or executive back home. So they needed a robust org chart back home, and one in the US. So they have to wait at least a year. You can't file an EB-1C the first year. So the first focus really is getting the business to the point where it'll sustain an extension. And then it might not get to the point where it would sustain an EB-1C green card application. So I have L1 clients that were fortunate enough to get the first extension, but I tell them it's not ripe yet to pull the trigger on an EB-1C. Build the business a little more, generate more revenue, hire a few more people, and then, and that's a lot to ask of someone just coming to a new country to put together this type of successful business in a relatively short period of time.
So I guess that's where it's appealing to franchise resale, where we
Hmm.
have, any given time, there's roughly 500 franchises for sale in California, more or less similar numbers in Florida that we have access to with our sister company, Vetted Biz. So, and usually they're 3 times the owner basically if the owner is making 100K, it would sell for 300K. If the
Hmm.
owner's making 300K, it would sell for about 900,000, a
It's a
million
multiple,
dollars.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's more or less the multiple. And then once the seller discretionary earnings gets up to like half a million, a million, then the multiple starts to really grow.
Hmm.
But those type of businesses, they have usually a pretty good org chart where we've helped clients, for example, invest in caregiving uh, franchises where you're sending caregivers to mostly seniors homes, and with that you have a VP of operations managing all the caregivers. You have a head of business development that's looking to get the actual seniors and
Hmm.
referrals from the hospital networks and doctors. So for a say 800K investment, there might be 50 caregivers and then another three staff. So it's a pretty
Hmm.
sizable business that I imagine could work for the EB1C.
Yeah, and you could leverage some independent contractors too. It's all part of the story that you develop and put together. It's got 8 full-time W-2 employees, and it's got 9 1099 contractors. So a lot of it is creative writing and how you put together a persuasive summary of what's going on. Now
And then
it's speaking of L's, E's, EB1Cs, there's no law that requires an EB1C to be launched from an L1. You can launch an EB1C from an E2 if the facts are if they're otherwise eligible. So we do that
and that
too,
gives
only
a lot
because I like,
more.
yeah, well, I like the E2 better here, but
Yeah.
it doesn't preempt you filing for an EB1C if the two companies are still related and he was a manager there and she was a manager here. You could still kind of mix and match these strategies.
And that's a misconception we get a lot where pretty much every client we've had that had the 5-year E2, if they wanted to stay, maybe 30% of people go back home. It's an experience for them in the US, business, family, etc. And then they go back home. They don't want the green card. But the ones that want to stay, usually they are able,
Hmm.
pretty much across the board, are able to get a green card somehow. But
Somehow.
it does take working with an attorney like you, Mitch, to kind of like, what's the roadmap? What are the options? And not wait 3 years into the investment to then decide, oh, what are my green
That's
card
right.
options?
Yeah, in my first preliminary consultation with a client that we identify E2 as the vehicle to physically get them here, I always ask, well, what's the ultimate objective? Are you looking just to develop a business and sell it here, or a business and have an American general manager run it, and you're going to go back and continue your successful life, or do you want to permanently immigrate? So if they say the latter, if they want to permanently immigrate, then we start talking about that strategy and how the two can really dovetail. And it's really fact specific. What may work for one family may not work for another. But yeah, we often mix and match E2s with EB-5, maybe E2 with labor certification, do a
Yeah.
labor market test with an unrelated company because it's a
A
rule
lot of
that
times the
a
spouse will
spouse.
be working and they're
That's
able
right.
to get a labor certificate and do the EB3 or EB2.
Yep. Yeah. We always ask what's the education and experience level of the spouse. I had an E2 consultation yesterday that by the time we were done, it was the wife who is going to be strategically the applicant. She has a relevant background. So that's part of the decision making also. He's a Brit and he has an IT consulting business in London, and he's been doing this for a while, and he wants to launch a similar company here. And I said, and he asked me, one of his first questions was, well, can I be a free agent? Can I also, work and build, through other entities? And I said, no, but tell me a little bit about your wife. Oh, she's an IT professional also. So she's going to be the E2 principal applicant, and he's going to get an unrestricted EAD work permit.
Have flexibility to
Yeah.
do
So,
whatever.
so that's a great way to kind of mix and match a strategy. You have to ask the right questions to get to the right answer.
And we've seen a rising trend really started January of last year for our clients doing the EB2 NAW, where
Hmm.
it seems like they opened it up at USCIS,
They have.
especially for the folks. Like we have a mutual client doing a home care franchise, healthcare related, education related, where depending where they're born, if you're born in certain countries, it doesn't make sense. But
India,
yeah, exactly. So if you're
because
born in India,
NIW
it
is
kind of
EB2, and that's a few decades backlogged.
yeah, so forget that, and we'll talk about the EB-5 in a second, but
Yeah.
It does seem like it's for
Yeah,
me, it was almost too good to be true, the EV2 and
yeah,
AW. Like, and
yeah,
I was waiting on the sidelines and I met these people that were getting approved and I'm like, "Oh wow, they're not like ridiculously impressive. They have a small
yeah.
business that's done pretty well and they're getting this national
Mhm.
interest waiver. There must be something to it."
Yeah, and you could self-sponsor. You don't even need to base it on your U.S. enterprise. You could just what they call self-sponsor, especially right now in many, not all, but many IT occupations, especially AI. So if you have, especially an advanced degree, and you're in AI, that's a really good
The doors are
NIW
open.
case. Yeah,
And I saw it like it's kind of counterintuitive when you look at like the geopolitics, but like Iran is like the number 3 country for NIWs.
that's right.
And we're just like poaching their all their engineers
Hmm.
and top scientists.
That's right. Yeah. But you're right about the nationality because it really doesn't make sense for anyone from India, which are most of the H-1Bs that are in the United States. China's number two. So there's backlogs for both countries, worse for India. So for an
What do you
Indian
see? Is there
client,
hope for Indians? I'm sure you get asked daily, if not weekly, like, is there going to be legislative change, regulatory change?
probably not. I mean, there's always bills bouncing around that have very little hope of getting passed into law. Not counting family members, increasing the numbers. Um, So, but they've been talking about. I've been doing this for almost 40 years, 38 years. They've been talking about it when I was in law school. So
Oh wow.
I'm, I'm not counting on that.
Yeah, and it's crazy when you think about the policy. Like you're born on the wrong side of the border, and all of a sudden
Yeah,
it's like
that's
not an
that's all it
option.
is. Yeah, like this E2 gentleman from London that I mentioned. He's Indian, but he's a UK citizen, and his wife's not a UK citizen yet. But he said she's eligible. He said, just give me the thumbs up, and in 60 days she could be a UK citizen. Speaking of E2s for Brits, so some countries, some treaties that we have with some countries have different nuances to it, and it shouldn't be taken for granted that any national from a treaty country can qualify. So what's interesting in the treaty between the U.S. and England, it was drafted in the late 1800s. E2s can only be issued for Brits who are living in England, in the UK. So if there are Brits, with the diaspora, they're all over the world. And if they're currently not residing in England, they're not eligible. So sometimes we have people go back home, live there for 6 months, get, arguably your residence back, although you're a
Exactly.
citizen, and then we can launch the British E2.
Yeah, we've had some unique cases where at the end of the day, it's like it's the risk that the applicant's willing to take on, but kind of what determines being domiciled. So like we've had
Yeah.
clients that don't actually make the move back, but they have a bank account, they have a an
Hmm.
apartment, but that's not ideal. But if they wanna try and give it a shot, then
Yeah.
they understand that
Really,
there's a risk.
that's right. It's really a subjective determination. They're not looking for a particular number of days, weeks, or months. So again, you have to kind of put together a pitch and say, listen, I've been in Malaga, Spain for the last 20 years, but the last 6 months I'm back, and here's my deed to the house that I bought, my British bank accounts, and so you just have to make a case and present it.
So let's talk about the EB-5 for a little bit, and we get a lot of interest from those born in India, and you were definitely like on the vanguard of helping Indians with the EB-5 and like
Yeah.
basically educating that market. What's the EB-5 direct, and how can it be applicable for a franchise investment?
Yeah, so there's two varieties of EB-5. One is called direct, and that's basically the way I describe it as the applicant's own entrepreneurial endeavor that they're going to run, just like an E2. The other and more common one is what we call a regional center EB-5 case. So there are entities out there called regional centers, which have basically a license to sponsor economic activity within the confines of their regional center, whether it's a county, a state, part of a county. So they look for projects within the confines of their regional center. Most of them are large scale real estate projects, like a big skyscraper is going up in Chicago, and they're trying to raise $100 million. Maybe there'll be 20 million in what they call a capital stack, reserved for EB-5 money. So then that project in that regional center goes out and tries to find a suitable number of EB-5 investors. So it's a passive equity investment. So the applicant can focus on what they do. They'll continue to make money back home if they're back home until they get called in for an immigrant visa appointment at the US consulate in their home country. If they're in the United States, maybe on an H-1B, an E-2, they can apply if there's no backlog issue, they could apply to have their status adjusted here. And right now for India, so you mentioned India, there's no backlog right now. We're in a kind of a strange point in time where there's no backlog for any country. So that's China, India, Vietnam. Historically, these three countries have been backlogged. So last year, March of 2022, they re-engineered the EB-5 rules, and they came up with these new investment categories, which just as a practical matter didn't have enough time or the opportunity to fill up. There's quotas still, but it just didn't have time to fill up yet. So they're all current. If you look on the monthly visa bulletin, it just says C next to India, China for EB-5. So what's really common now to have an Indian H-1B person file for EB-5, and you could do it concurrently, file the EB-5 application, make the investment along with an adjustment of status application. You get a work permit in about 3 months, travel pass called advanced parole a couple of months later, and they could either get through the whole process and get the green card before India EB-5 backlogs, which is going to happen. We're not sure when, maybe another year or so. But as long as they file the adjustment of status package, they're going to get extendable work permits, extendable travel passes. So the case may go, the green card application component may go back on the shelf until their turn is reached if they didn't make it to the finish line. But at least they're not locked to their H-1B employer. And the only other options for an Indian, EB-2, EB-3, as we alluded to, decades backlogged.
Yeah, forget it.
So it's rough.
And the
Indians
H-1B
really don't have.
employer, like having friends in Miami that now most of them are off it, but like their wages were lower than it should have been, like by like 30K, 40K, like
Well,
working in
that's
finance tech, like
it's
if they were on the open market and they could port their visa or they just had the green card, like they'd definitely be earning more
yes,
money.
it's not supposed to be that way. And actually, since we represent a lot of employers who employ
Yeah,
H-1Bs, I could tell you that there's a prevailing wage requirement. So it's not as common as you might think. A lot of the anti-immigrant crowd says, well, they're
sure.
getting cheap labor, paying a minimum wage, they have a PhD degree. You can't get an H-1B for somebody in that type of scenario. So oftentimes, for some technical reasons, they actually have to pay the H-1B worker more
A
than a
little
U.S.
higher.
worker, and there's a lot of compliance, there's a lot of postings, there's notice requirements. You have to pay a guy like me. You have to pay
We've gone through the
exorbitant
process and
filing
it was
fees.
definitely a pain. I guess
Yeah,
where I see it, like definitely the first year or two, there's not like that big discrepancy. But if
right.
it's like been year 5 and they're selling H-1B and they've moved up the ladder, like
Hmm.
I think that's where the wage discrepancy might happen.
Could be. Yeah,
Um,
could be.
so for these Indians that, for whatever reason don't just want to get the green card, want to have the citizenship, they've been on H-1B or whatever non-immigrant visa category. What do you want to see before they apply for the EB-5? Like, can they invest in a preschool clothing resale business, a food franchise? Like, do they have to invest the full 800K in a rural or low unemployment area, or could it be partial investment? What are
Mm.
you guys comfortable putting forward? As we get these questions a lot.
Yeah, it can be what we call a partial. That's the term on the street. I prefer a fully funded EB-5 case, but it's clear, and we've been very successful in these partials. But what I want to see for a partial is a compelling reason why, because there's one rule that says the application has to be approvable upon filing. So maybe a good partial scenario that we recently did a few weeks ago is they put 500K down, so they needed 300 more. They had about 400K in equity in their home,
Hmm.
and they're going through a HELOC, a home equity line of
Okay.
credit, and it just takes a while to get all that paperwork done. And they're otherwise eligible, they're ready to file, and they want to get that early priority date, which you get upon filing, because they're anticipating they're anticipating them possibly getting caught up in retrogression down the road. So we explain all that. We put in the loan documents the ones that are available at that time. And we explain it's going to be fully funded in 90 days, 120
Okay.
days, 180 days. And then when they're liquid, when we can do that, we have a supplemental filing, and now we're okay.
Hmm.
If they get to the application before it's fully funded, it's not fatal, but you'll get an RFE, a request for evidence, and they'll say, well, what's going on? We can't approve it until it's fully funded. So some of these rural regional center cases are getting approved in 3, 4, 5 months. So that's why we want to make sure that the supplemental filing is going to be even shorter than that, because
What is
we
a
always try to avoid
supplemental filing?
documentation about the balance of the 800K that's required. So the
Okay.
loan documents, the loan
Making
came
that
in,
clear.
here it is, and here's the evidence of the wire into the project. Yeah.
And so on the direct, do you want to see like an executed lease and say that they've invested like 500K and it's, or, 600K or whatever threshold?
Yeah. Now, what dictates the amount, the requisite amount, is the location of the business. So if the franchise is in a targeted employment area, that's in this case, it'll have to be what they call a high unemployment area. It's 800K. If it's not, most businesses, most good businesses that you would probably want are not in TEAs. Fortunately, the delta is not too significant. If the business is not in a targeted employment area, the investment threshold is $1,050,000. So it's 250K difference. May be significant to some people, not significant to many. So I'd rather have a solid business that's making a lot more
If you can
money.
do 1,050,000, do it. Yeah, don't
Right.
mess around.
That's right.
And could you like buy the building, or could you buy like a condo, whatever, a condo office, like if you're running like a
Well,
medical business?
yeah, it all has to be business related. So if you're living in it also, maybe they'll kind of, break that out a little bit, the value of the residential portion. But yeah, it could be inventory, it could be brick and mortar, uh, equipment. So there's a separate type of business plan. We mentioned the E2 business plan and the L1 business plan. There's an even more robust business plan requirement for EB-5. There's an EB-5 business plan that's a lot more detailed, and that's going to really bear out job creation. So the big difference really between E2s and EB-5, they're both investment options, investment-based immigration tools. But the EB-5 results in a green card. E2 does not. Investment's much more for EB-5, but EB-5 by design is a job creation vehicle. There's a job creation component to E2, but an EB-5 can only be successful if it creates 10 full-time jobs. So a lot of my prospective EB-5 clients that are really looking to do a direct may have a great business model. They're buying a franchise or whatever they did back home, they're going to try to replicate here. But they explain it's very lean. It just needs me and a laptop. I could run it on the beach. I don't need to employ anybody. That's the beauty of this. I said, that's great. You could make a lot of money, but you're not going to get an EB-5 green card that way. So we have to look for another option. We'll figure that out. It's a
How
big,
does it
it's a
work when the employees aren't all on site? Like, so say medical caregiving or real estate property management,
as
there's
long as as long
cleaners
as it's
who,
as long as U.S. jobs and it's anywhere, especially if it's not in a TEA. So that's a good example of a bad TEA case. So that's $1,050,000 case. So now it doesn't matter where the
so if the
job creation
jobs,
is.
so like you're more comfortable if the jobs are not all going to be on that site within that TA, it's better to
Yeah,
invest more so you're not.
yeah,
Okay,
right.
that's clear.
Yeah, that's right.
Uh,
So just numbers wise, direct EB-5 cases are about 5% of all
yeah,
EB-5
small.
cases. But it's common though to leverage an E2 if you can strategize and plan in advance. Okay, I'm going to do an E2 now, but Mitch, help me set up so I can launch a direct EB-5 off of this business also down the road. Once we start employing some U.S. workers and it needs $1,050,000, I could get the E2 for 250, let's say. So as you grow, maybe you'll expand, you'll get more territories in the franchise. So as soon as you can spend and invest $1,050,000, then it's ripe to launch a direct EB-5 off the E2.
And how does it work for those born in India where, even if they invest 1,050,000 and it's like, because I hear different things, I guess, taking a step back, in terms of like high unemployment versus like rural. And in 6 months or 12 months, if they do a direct or regional center investment in a high unemployment or in a rural, it's different than if they do it like in, right in Newport Beach, and they might be backlogged in that
Yeah,
case.
direct or regional center. If it's in a TEA, it's in a TEA. It's fine. So right now, though, the real distinction between rural and high unemployment is there's more visas allocated to rural investments. So there's a 20% what they call set aside, 10% for high unemployment, and rural cases get what's called priority adjudication. We didn't know what that meant until just recently when they started approving some of these. And I
You're getting
previously
letters in
mentioned
your
to you,
office. It should be
yeah,
what, like 2 years, and it's 80
yeah,
days.
yeah. We just recently, about a month ago now, 3 or 4 weeks ago, we got a rural case 526, which is the EB-5 petition number, approved in 85 days. So that's pretty remarkable. This particular client investor is in China, so we have to still process through the National Visa Center and get the immigrant visa appointment in Beijing. But it seems like they're keeping their word. So rural ones are getting approved faster, whether it's 85 days or 3 or 4 or 6 months. It's still relatively lightning fast compared to what the EB-5 world used to look like. And even high unemployments are getting approved relatively quickly, about a year, 12, 13 months we're seeing. So that's not bad.
And what are you seeing for those applicants that are going to apply overseas? Is it like a year or so to get the appointment and get the
Yeah,
card?
yeah, about, because once the 526 is approved, the Immigration Service has to forward the file to this other agency called the National Visa Center, the NVC. And sometimes that takes a few months before they get around to sending it over. And then the NVC, it's their job to get these people, these applicants, what they call documentarily qualified or DQ'd, where they request all kinds of civil documents, birth certificates, marriage certificates, police certificates, medicals. So once they have all this for each family member, and it's still current, there's no backlog, they then notify the relevant US consulate, wherever in the world that may be. And depending on their backlog, you're getting in the appointment scheduling queue. That and you have to really, you have to get to the point where the visa is issued before before it backlogs. So for China and India, that's a risk. So it's a real race. It's not, if you get in when you file, that's only part of the victory. You have to get the immigrant visa or adjustment of status approved while it's not backlogged.
Huh. I didn't realize. I thought, okay, interesting. I didn't realize like you're not that you could get you could lose out like during that 1 year wait. So it really
Yeah,
benefits people that are already here. And there's
yeah.
a few visas like O1 and some other categories that allow for dual intent.
Hmm.
Um, but I
That's right.
guess it becomes tricky with some folks that are maybe want to do the EB-5 and they're coming on a student visa, but that's not really allowed. So it's definitely
Yeah,
I guess
yeah.
case by case.
If yeah, so you mentioned dual intent. So briefly, clearly H's and L's have dual intent, which means you can safely enter on an L1, which is a non-immigrant visa, and file for a green card the next day. No
Yeah.
issue. You can file for the green card before you even apply for the L.
Hmm.
No issue. But those are the only two by law that have dual intent. Others kind of are in the gray area, and some are clearly in the non-dual intent camp, like a B2 visitor, F1. Um, but we do a lot of EB-5 for F1s. They're here for a while. They haven't gone home for 6 months or 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 months. Circumstances can change. So that type of person right now, since there's no backlog, can file EB-5 concurrently with an adjustment of status application, get a work permit in 3 or 4 months. This way, when the F1 graduates, they don't have to deal with that crazy H1 lottery. They don't. It's much easier to get a job with any U.S. employer if they can just say, "I have a work permit." You don't have to sponsor it. You don't have to pay a guy like Mitch to file for an H-1B for me. I'm good to go from day one. So it's pretty popular with F1s right now. H1s are really good cases because especially if they're working for a public company and they have stock, they're working for Amazon, Google, Facebook, they just peel off a few shares of stock. That's 800K, and I can file the application next week. Those are
Yeah,
great
no, I didn't
cases.
think of it like that. There must be a lot
Mhm.
of technologists that are thinking about that EB-5 really is a quite a viable
Especially
path
if
to
if you're
transport.
Indian, they're already in the EB2 queue, but they realize it's going to be decades, and they could lawfully remain here in H1 status, but their life is kind of on hold. You're kind of beholden to that employer, and you don't have the mobility throughout the economy that they would like, the certainty. They're still a non-immigrant. They could get deported at any time if they screw up. So they want to solidify their their green card strategy, and EB-5 is a really good solution for those
And
Indians and Chinese.
for those F1, H1B, or whatever visa holders that are looking to do a direct, what's the best way to make sure that they're really investing in a high unemployment or rural area so that they don't run into retrogression issues like going into June or whatever of next year?
Yeah, there are maps out there. There are resources. If anyone has a question about any particular geography, they really have to look at the address of the location of the business, because on one side of the street could be a TEA and the other side of the street may not be. So
And
with
what will
an address.
USCIS use at the end of the day? Because that's one thing that changed, where it used to be like
Yeah,
the state that would
yeah,
determine, but
that's right.
now.
If it now it's a federal determination, and even if that changes, as long as you are investing in a TEA when you filed, even if it later fell out of TEA, you're okay.
So basically, when presenting the case with the business plan writer, they just have to show that whatever census tract is a TEA, and
That's
that it
right.
should be eligible.
That's right.
Mitch, before we go into the questions, is there anything that we didn't cover that you get asked a lot in your many consultations?
Well, it's probably most common once the applicant is successfully in the United States with an E-2. They bought the franchise and they have the E-2. It's always the next conversation is always the green card. So here's where, if you recall, I mentioned that there's a prohibition on a company sponsoring someone for a green card if they have an ownership interest or a meaningful ownership interest in it, because you have to do a labor market test generally, and you're unlikely to fire yourself and locate and hire a U.S. worker. So here's where we always look and focus on the spouse. What's the skill set? What's the education level? So and the spouse has an unrestricted work permit. So maybe they have a job already with some unrelated company. So that company can go through the PERM, they call it, the labor market test process, EB-3, EB-2, unless you're from India, and that just gets you on a very slow boat. But if you're from just about any other country, that's always a viable option. If the person's
And
unmarried, maybe while they're here, they fall in love with a U.S. citizen. That anything could happen.
And the key for the perm, because I've gone through the process a few times, it's like it's really important that the employer is working with an attorney that has like a very high approval rate and really
That's right.
knows, because
Yeah,
it
it's a
is a bit
science.
nitpicky where if you don't have everything perfect,
Yeah,
there's failures, and
it's an
it's all
unforgiving
public
process.
data. I think Fragaman's rates like 99.8% or 100%, but you do have a lot of attorneys where for a quarter their approval rates like 50, 30%, and
Right.
they had helped a lot of employees, but they messed up in some way along the
Yeah.
path, and that can seriously derail
Mhm.
your green card trajectory and then your family's plan if the E-2 visa is running out.
That's right. And it's a very unforgiving process. As you say, if you check off the wrong box or if you answer something incorrectly, their algorithm just spits out a denial. Then
Yeah, we had that
either it's
happen
fatal or
where
you have to start over again.
there was something with the address wasn't correct, and it delayed like 9 months, and it was just
Yeah,
there was nothing that we could do, and yeah, so definitely
that's
go
right.
push your employer to work with an attorney that has great experience.
Yeah.
Um, so we'll go through some questions, Mitch.
Yeah.
Um, Sandra's asking, can the investment be made between two parties?
I'm not sure what they're
I
getting
guess
at
I
there.
assume for maybe for a franchise investment for the E-2 or the EB-5, can like two family members or two friends make the investment in the business?
Yeah, if they have qualifying nationality, they can. And if it's immediate family, if it's a spouse, of course, the spouse just tags along. But yeah,
And
you
then
could
for
have
EB-5,
two
it changed because you used to be able to have multiple
in a
EB-5 direct
direct.
investors, but now
Right
you can
now.
only have one?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Pooled investments were permissible for direct, no longer.
Okay. And then from Sophia, can you talk about the source of funds, what's important to consider, and if there are any restrictions?
Sure. So this is the heavy lift in any EB-5 case, documenting not only the source but the path of the funds. So if you view it as an anti-money laundering exercise. It's kind of a forensic exercise, really. They want to make sure it's clean money. In India, they call it white money. It's got to be white money. So we have to show how the money was earned, accumulated, and where it's been from earnings all the way into wiring it into the escrow of the project that you select. So it's unusual that a high earner would just pile up money in his or her savings account and then just have it liquid. These are smart people. They're entrepreneurial. They're buying different assets, real estate, mutual funds, stocks, bonds. So oftentimes they have to liquidate that or take out a loan against the equity they might have in some real estate. So that's the path. So the way I like to describe it to clients is we need a piece of paper for every leg of every journey of every dollar. And there's 800,000 of them. So just to kind of set their expectations that don't just send me like 2 tax returns and expect it's going to be a winner.
What's your record in terms of number of pages for a source of funds?
Well, we file them in big banker boxes. They're, a meter thick.
I've seen it.
Yeah, it's very old school. It's not e-filing. Some applications, some case types you can e-file, but not EB-5. I mean, we have a truck back up over here and, and pick up the package. So some source of fund scenarios are more complex than others. I mentioned the one where if it's an H-1B working for Google.
Yeah.
Wait, let me not get this. Hold on. If it's an H-1B working for Google, they peel off a few shares of stock. That's an easy one. On the other side of the spectrum, if they're getting a gift from parents, they're here in F1 getting a gift from mom and dad who has ancestral property in rural India that great grandfather bought 65 years ago when there's no records at all. That's good. It's not impossible, but that's a tougher one. Okay. Usually we have to put together a few what we call declarations to fill in some of the gaps, and most applications have a gap or two. It's not fatal. The legal standard is preponderance. Is this scenario valid according to a preponderance of the evidence? More likely than not that the scenario presented is truthful.
I saw there was an uptick. It seemed like it's leveled off, but there were a lot of denials for a few quarters for the I-526 petition for the EB-5.
Yeah.
Do you know what that was? It the source of funds or why there were so many denials?
Both. There's a lot of new players getting into the game who are learning on other people's lives, basically. So it could either be a deficiency in the source of funds, or it could be a deficiency from the project or the regional center. Maybe there was something missing in their offering documents or the PPM, the private placement memorandum. So probably an equal number of times or RFEs, maybe not denials, that we've seen are issues being picked on by the project as to the source of funds paperwork. So it could be either one.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes again to the volume aspect with Fragment with the EB-3, but also on the EB-5. Like you want a firm that does like serious volume, so they can understand the trends and how to put everything together. And it's the same reason why our clients, time after time, like franchises, that they're not the first one opening up, and there's been another 200 people with that, and it should hopefully go a lot smoother.
We take a real conservative approach. We're tough on our clients because we're anticipating the case being adjudicated by a tough officer. Some are easier than others.
So, and that's great.
It's really important that I kind of set their expectations. I tell them flat out, this is going to be a heavy lift. You're going to be pushing and pulling documents with my source of funds team on a daily basis. They're going to ask for a lot of stuff. So how we operationalize it is, at the beginning of one of these cases, we request a written narrative of their source of funds scenario. I would have had by that point a general understanding of it, but now it's really detailed. Which stocks are you going to liquidate? Which real estate are you going to sell? Which one you're going to take out a loan against? So once we get that detailed narrative of their source of funds scenario, my source of funds team that I supervise personally analyzes it and generates a one-page unique source of funds document checklist for that case. And that's the working document. So we're working off that document every day, pushing and pulling documents. And sometimes the source of funds scenario morphs. So I decided not to sell that building, and I'm going to look at another asset. So it can get derailed and a little more complicated. But usually it takes a good couple of months to put together a good, strong case.
And then from Tremblay David, for a first-time franchise investor, what type of visa do you recommend?
Well, it's going to be in an L or an E, most likely in E. So we want to know what their U.S. immigration objectives are. As I mentioned a little earlier, is it's just to develop a business that you can sell and make some money and stay back home, or do you want to make a life for yourself here? So it's yeah, it's usually going to be an E2. But if it's an ongoing franchise and not one that you're going to develop a brand new store from the ground up, it's not likely to be what they call a new office. So you're not going to get just that 1 year on an L1. You may get 3 years. So then it's 3-2-2 to get up to the 7 years. So it's got a track record already. It has employees already. It has revenue already. So it's not a new risky business in the eyes of the Immigration Service. So if it's an ongoing business, I'll consider more the L1 route than I otherwise would have. But I still usually defer to an E if they're from an E country.
And on the existing business side, like for the EB-5, how do you see it where, say, they buy an existing preschool and then, has 15 teachers, and they add on a wing and they add on another 15 teachers, or they don't add on teachers in that location, but they open up a second preschool. Is that possible? Can you get the EB-5 that way?
Yeah, as long as all that's in the business plan, because I like to see an additional 10. So if they have 15 employees now, when you're making the investment, I want to see in a reasonable amount of time that you're going to generate or create 10 more jobs. So yeah, it could
Can
be
that be done
prospective
with
like
a
that.
second location, or does it have to be
Yeah.
done like in that? Okay.
Second location, it probably won't be a TEA case, but that's fine. It'll be in
Yeah.
a million 50K case. But all that has to be kind of baked into the business plan. So the vision has to be there on the front end.
Okay. Mitch, anything else? You've been very gracious with your time. Any concluding thoughts that our audience should consider?
No, the E other than the E2 is one of my favorite non-immigrant categories. I
Yeah.
mean, just because the challenges we've gone over with the L1, the H1 has the crazy lottery. O1s, you have to demonstrate your extraordinary ability. Just the E2, it's they're more fun for me and my team to work with. We can get a little creative as to how we strategize and how we put together the application. So if you're from an E2 country, I think it's a great employment authorized visa to consider. And think of, if you're a married couple, think of which one should be the principal applicant, who needs to be tied to the business and who wants the open market work permit.
Mitch, what's the best way for our audience to have a consultation with you or your team to see which visa category makes the most sense for their entrepreneurial endeavors?
Just shoot me an email personally. It's just mwexler@fragaman.com. You could find me
We'll add
on
that
the
on the
firm's
screen.
website. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I respond to all my emails personally and pretty quickly. So we'll set you up for a call and hopefully we'll be able to help you.
Awesome. Well,
And I thank
Mitch,
you for the opportunity, Patrick. It's always
no, it's
nice
great.
chatting with you, and look forward to doing it again.
Definitely. Thanks so much, Mitch, and for everyone that joined in today.
Okay, all the best, Patrick. Bye bye. Thank you.